Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you all in today's program tabbed out Water Scarcity and Governance in Mumbai. I also welcome our eminent speakers, some of whom are from academics, but also from governance and administration. Today's moderator is Dr. Ravina Agrawal, the Director for Columbia Global Centers at Mumbai.
Welcome everybody to Tapped Out Water Scarcity and Governance in Mumbai, organized by the Columbia Global Centers Mumbai. This center is one of 9 global centers of Columbia University that were set up to promote knowledge exchange, public awareness and dialogue, as well as support innovative ways of addressing the most pressing global challenges facing us today. And water surely is one such challenge. This event is part of the center's ongoing engagement, and this is a multi-year engagement we've had with issues of water access, conservation, and management. And the event is also supported by the President's Global Innovation Fund at Columbia University. So water in India is governed, as a public good. Yet in spite of being one of the fundamental human rights, a large percentage of the Indian population does not have access to tap water. As per the NSSO survey of 2018, in urban areas, only 2 out of every 5 families have access to tap waters, which is, better than rural areas where there is 1 out of 10. And only 25% of the urban population has adequate availability of water on a daily basis. It's also estimated that 3.7% of India's population is affected by waterborne diseases annually. And children suffer from diarrhea, etc., and stunted growth issues. In terms of conservation, our cities are huge consumers of water and face the real possibility of running out of water in the next decade. India's groundwater dependency makes this a huge challenge if we do not have adequate plans for regeneration and renewal. So what can be done in terms of management of supply and distribution through policies and regulation and governance at the central, state, municipal, and community levels? This is a question that our panelists are going to address today. I invite them to share their research and work by sharing with us the stresses faced by Mumbai and their analysis of governance modes and practices that can make an efficient, environmentally friendly and inclusive system of water distribution possible. Our first speaker is going to be Nikhar Gaikwad, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and a member of the Committee of Global Thought at Columbia University. Professor Gaikwad's research interests span international and comparative political economy with a focus on the politics of trade, migration, and environmental policy making. He has a regional specialization in India, where he studies in comparative perspective with other democratic emerging economies. His work has been published in several leading publications, and he has received multiple awards, including the David A. Lake Award, Franklin L. Burdett Award, Pi Sigma Alpha Award, the Kellogg Notre Dame Award, and the Juan Linz Prize. Our next speaker will be Dr. Nikhil Anand, who is an associate professor and an environmental anthropologist whose research focuses on cities, infrastructure, state power, and climate change. He addresses these questions by studying the political ecology of cities, read through the different lives of water. Some of you might be aware of his award-winning first book, Hydraulic City, Water and the Infrastructures of Politics in Mumbai, which examines the everyday ways in which cities and citizens are made through the management of water infrastructure. He is the author of several articles and was awarded the Junior Scholar Prize by the Anthropology and Environment Society in 2014. His new book project, Urban Seas, is based on field research with fisheries, scientists, and planners, and it draws readers' attention to the ways in which climate change seas are remaking coastal cities today. And surely that's, again, very relevant to Mumbai. Following Professor Anand will be our next speaker, Kutsia Contractor. Dr. Contractor is a junior fellow at the Max Weber Center for Advanced Cultural and Social Studies at the University of Erfurt. She has previously been an assistant professor at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai and the Institute for Social and Economic Change in Bangalore. She's been a fellow at Columbia and the New School universities, and her research interests include the anthropology of cities and development, social identities and communal politics, and her work has been published in peer-reviewed journals and edited volumes, including one edited by Lauren Gayer and Christopher Jaffrelot entitled Muslims in Indian Cities, Trajectories of Marginalization, published by Hearst and Company. Our last speaker, we're very excited to have join us, is Dr. Abhay Mahajan, who is a civil engineer of the 1988 batch from the erstwhile Vishwaveshwarya College of Engineering, now at VNIT Nagpur. After he was inducted into the Indian Administrative Services, Dr. Mahajan has consistently been engaging with water supply and infrastructure and revenues in the various government service jobs he has held. He's now Joint Secretary at the Water Supply and Sanitation Department of the Government of Maharashtra. He's also been the project director for a World Bank-aided water supply project, which, among other things, has a mainstay of 60 semi-urban water supply schemes. So this is a really stellar list of panelists, all with deep knowledge of Mumbai. And of course, we want to investigate and go deeper into Mumbai with a view to understanding not only the city, but how it opens a window for us to understand urban India and, of course, the plight of cities and water worldwide. So welcome to you all, and let's begin with our first speaker, Professor Gaikwad.
Hello, and thank you all for coming. Ravina, I really appreciate your very kind introduction. A big thanks to the Columbia Mumbai Global Center for organizing this symposium and for bringing together such an excellent group of panelists to speak about this topic of immense scholarly and public policy importance. So the title of my presentation today is Getting on the Grid, a field experiment on public service access in India. Now, this is joint work with two of my co-authors, Gareth Nellis, who is a professor at the University of California in San Diego, and Dr. Anjali Thomas, who's a professor at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Both are available on this panel and will be joining us during Q&A. So I'd like to motivate this project by pointing out that governments around the world frequently struggle with providing basic public services to their citizens. This is true across the world, from cities such as Mexico City to Cape Town to Jakarta. It's certainly true in India and in Mumbai, where, as Dr. Agarwal mentioned, we know that citizens have struggled over the past couple of decades in seeking to access government-provided water. Now, informal water provision, which leads to citizens being off the grid, can be quite detrimental to society. This kind of water is private. Sometimes it's illegal. Oftentimes it's very expensive. Research shows that private water is up to 250 times the cost of government-provided water. We know that private water tends to be low quality, irregular, and as a result of citizens not getting access to public water, it also leads to citizens remaining invisible to the state, breaking the contract between the state and citizens. So by contrast, when citizens are able to access water provision, we think that this leads to many more beneficial outcomes for society. Government-provided water is public, it's legal, it's subsidized by the state, it's regulated by health authorities, it's reliable. It leads to a source of revenue for government, and it creates a strong link between citizens and the government, making citizens key stakeholders in policy making. This leads to the major research question that we try to answer in this project, which is how can the state and how can civil society actors help citizens formalize access to water? And that's going to be the overarching theme of this study. Before proceeding any further, I'd like to point out that in order to conduct this research, we worked with a vast number of stakeholders. This is a large multi-stakeholder studies, and I'd like to acknowledge all the help that we received. So this study was funded by the UK Development Agency. We worked alongside two really terrific NGOs in Mumbai, Pani Hak Samiti and Yuva, and I know they're represented from both NGOs on the webinar today. We had hundreds of volunteers participate in the study. Hundreds of communities were involved and were studied in this research. We worked alongside another research organization in Lucknow, Morsel, to evaluate the study, and had an excellent project manager, Mayur Hilia, lead the research on the ground. In order to now give you a sense of how this study was conducted, I first want to just introduce you to the theoretical framework that we designed and wanted to evaluate in the context of this research. So when thinking about how citizens might not have access to public services such as water, we think that there are three kinds of actors that are quite important. So on the one hand, you have citizens who want to get access to government services. On the other side of the spectrum, there are the bureaucracy, which is evaluating citizen requests and trying to provide these services to citizens. And then you also have elected politicians that are working alongside bureaucrats to try and give access to these services to citizens. So when we think about bureaucrats, at least two responsibilities come to mind. One is performing the job duties. When applications by citizens come through to the bureaucracy, bureaucrats evaluate these applications and then act on them. Bureaucrats also tend to be accountable to elected representatives. And we're thinking about these linkages when we design the study. When we think about politicians, politicians themselves also are responsible to citizens. There's an electoral link between how politicians are thinking about providing services to citizens. And then on the other hand, politicians are working alongside the bureaucracy in order to ensure that these public services are provided. On the side of citizens, there are two constraints though. So citizens want access to these services, but we find that sometimes citizens find it difficult to navigate through the complex processes associated with bureaucratic requests. So that leads us to say that navigating the bureaucracy might be hard for average citizens, especially poorer citizens who might not have had the experiences interacting with the state. On the other side of the spectrum, we find that citizens also find it hard to coordinate politically, to be able to come up with a consolidated set of requests and petition politicians and elected representatives to move forward with these requests. So this theoretical framework is exactly what we use when trying to come up with our research design. We have, in our study, we had two sets of interventions. One was an intervention associated with bureaucratic assistance. In the bureaucratic assistance intervention, we were assisting citizens with completing water applications, submitting forms, following up with the municipal corporation in order to see that these forms were acted upon. Our hypothesis was that assistance with navigating the bureaucratic process will increase formalization for citizens. On the other hand, we also think that citizens need to come up with, overcome these collective action problems and coordinate and be able to convey their interests to their elected representatives. So on the second side of the research design, we organized community events in communities that were looking to get access to government provided water to signal local mobilization around the water, around issues surrounding water access. Our hypothesis here was that political coordination will increase formalization. The site of our study is the city of Mumbai. As a lot of you know, Mumbai has a large proportion of non-notified communities and bastis that lack access to municipally provided water. We also know that in 2014, the Bombay High Court declared that the government cannot deny water supply to any communities, whether they're notified or non-notified. So keeping that legal background in mind, we wanted to see what is still preventing citizens in a lot of communities in the city from getting access to water. So on the left-hand panel, I have a graph in which we show the various sites of our study. We identified 76 bastis, which were then divided into 152 basti clusters with around 150 to 200 households in each cluster. From each of these clusters, we randomly selected 50 households to study. And we identified these bastis from almost a year of fieldwork in which we worked alongside NGO reports, government lists, snowball sampling methods, in order to really identify which are the communities which don't have access to water and come up with a representative sample of this set of communities. So the timeline of our study was that in 2017, we began identifying these communities. In early 2018, we conducted a baseline survey of these communities. From 2018 to 2019, we conducted the two interventions I just outlined earlier in the last slide. And then in the middle of 2018, we conducted an endline survey. So let me first begin by giving you a little bit of information about the communities we were interacting with. In our baseline survey, we collected information about our sample. The median household income was 12,000 rupees per month. The sample has low rates of education. 36% of our respondents could not read or write, 64% lacked primary education, 88% lacked access to household toilets, and 43% of the communities did not have sewage collection within the settlement. So this is indicative of the kinds of bastis that do not have access to government provided water. The social profile of these communities is also quite interesting and noteworthy. 70% of residents had been born outside of Maharashtra. Minorities are overrepresented. 38% of our sample are Muslim, 63% are SC/ST, and 35% of our sample did not hold local voter ID cards. So in terms of water access, we find that the households in our sample did not have access to BMC water. 43% were relying on community-oriented pipes. 41% were looking to get water from private vendors. 25% were getting water from private hand pumps and bore wells. 58% of our sample reported that they did not have enough water to meet basic needs on a day-to-day basis. But what's also very noteworthy is that 95% of our sample expressed an interest in getting BMC water. They believed that municipal water would be easier, cheaper, and better quality. So there was a lot of pent-up demand in our sample for getting access to municipal water. So let me now explain what our experimental interventions look like. So as I mentioned earlier, the first set of interventions had to do with bureaucratic assistance, working alongside our excellent NGO partners and the large number of community volunteers that participated in this study. We had groups of volunteers visit clusters that were randomly assigned to this treatment condition. Here, community organizers helped households create groups of 5 to 10 households. They helped residents acquire proofs of residency, complete the application processes associated with applying to the BMC for a water connection, help them acquire the signatures of licensed plumbers, submit these applications online, and then conduct follow-up visits with the BMC, as the photos below indicate. The second intervention had to do with political coordination. As I mentioned earlier, our workers and volunteers helped residents put up banners to raise awareness. They helped residents sign petitions and send letters to elected representatives. And they organized delegations of residents to visit offices of local bureaucrats and elected representatives. So to give you a sense of what we were looking at in terms of the outcomes, as you might know, the process of getting a water connection is a multi-stage process. It involves submitting an application. Once the application is submitted, a representative from the BMC will visit the community to evaluate the application. If all the documentation is correct and the authorization is given, first a P form is provided. And then down the line, the final step is the provision of a municipal water connection. So in our evaluation, we're going to be looking at both along this stepwise process, how far communities went in getting access to water, as well as the final stage, that they end up getting tapped water from the BMC. So to give you a sense of the results in a nutshell, we find that the interventions had a significant impact and led to an increase in the applications submitted to the BMC for water connection. So compared to our control group, where we did not provide any sort of assistance with the application process, in both the treatment 1 and treatment 2 conditions, we find that residents were much more likely to submit applications to the BMC. I would also point out one interesting feature of our finding, which is the results in terms of increases in applications were really driven by increases in applications in the treatment 1 conditions. So the places where NGO workers helped residents complete the applications, navigate the electoral process and bureaucratic process, that's exactly where applications ended up becoming more salient. By contrast, in the clusters and bastis where we help people organized politically, we actually do not find a statistically significant increase in applications submitted. So that's something I will return to in a couple of minutes. So to just give you a sense of the results in a quantitative format, we find that the process of assisting citizens with submitting these application forms, navigating the electoral bureaucracy, leads to a significant increase in the level of formalization. So this is looking at the 3-step process: visits from the BMC, the provision of a P form, as well as the last stage of getting applications. By contrast, as I just mentioned, the political coordination assistance that we provided we find that it's by itself does not have a significant effect on the applications submitted, as well as the level of formalization provided. That said, I also want to point out a feature of our results. While we found that citizens were able to move ahead on the three-step process of receiving water, at least in our evaluation in 2019, when we compared the control group and treatment groups, we don't find an impact on the final stage of formalization, which is the provision of actual tapped water flowing to a household. And this is something that we think that might change over time as the BMC is able to work on these applications further. Okay, so I just wanted to point out two things. Why do these interventions not produce full formalization? You may want to ask. We have two sets of explanations that we explored a little bit more systematically. The first is looking at the role of brokers. Now, a lot of the panelists today have done a lot of work related to brokers in the context of water access. And so we wanted to see whether brokers are important for service delivery in this context, because brokers will help citizens mediate the bureaucracy, as past work has shown. Well, what we find over here is that in communities, in bastis where citizens worked alongside brokers, these are precisely the communities where full formalization was achieved. So overall, in our overall sample, in our treatment groups, we did not find that final water flowed through tap connections, but in communities that brokers assisted citizens with their applications, we actually do find significant increases in that final stage of formalization. So that's something that we found to be very interesting, and also provides an optimistic sort of set of policy guidelines for how governments can perhaps work alongside brokers to help citizens try and access services from the state. The second set of explanations we thought had to do potentially with political resistance. We know from prior work that when it comes to electoral politics, identity politics are prevalent in many parts of India, around the world as well. We wanted to explore the possibility whether politicians, some kinds of politicians might be more resistant to the kind of collective action pressure that did not lead to the second treatment having a significant effect. What we find over here is an interesting set of results, which we're still trying to work through ourselves. We find that T2, which is a political coordination campaign, had a positive and significant effect for members of minority groups. So it's precisely minority groups that are able to use this political coordination to try and get access from elected representatives for full formalization. This is, again, a set of findings which speaks very closely with Dr. Contractor's work on minorities and their access to water in the city. So just to conclude, what do we find with this study up till now? We find that bureaucratic assistance, helping citizens navigate these complex processes associated with applying for water, can have a powerful effect in moving citizens up the formalization ladder. We also find that this assistance might not be enough to achieve this last stage, which is the final provision of water. And it's in cases where we have brokers, dalals, middlemen, those are the kind of cases where we do find last mile delivery taking place. And then finally, we find that bottom-up pressure can trigger full formalization in communities that are perhaps less represented electorally in the state. I just wanted to end by presenting a few photos of the fieldwork that we've conducted in this study. These are just a few photos, but I'd like to also just take a moment to thank the hundreds of volunteers, our terrific partners with in the non-governmental organization field, for the time and effort that they've put into this project. And say finally that we are hoping and planning on doing one more round of evaluations next year, where we hope to see and evaluate whether some of these last mile stages of formalization, the provision of the final stages of water come through. And we're very optimistic and hopeful for that. So without further ado, thank you once again for giving me this opportunity to share our research with the group.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gaikwad, for this kind invitation, and to Garth and Anjali as well, for having an opportunity to think with this exciting work. Thanks also to Aditya Petwal, Ravina Agarwal, and Brenda Marbanmiyang at the Columbia Global Center for handling all the logistics. And most of all, thank you to all our interlocutors and colleagues and collaborators in Mumbai, engineers at the Water Department and NGOs and movements, thinking particularly of Sitaram Shilar of the Panihat Samiti, In community organizations, Vasant Tambore, Durga Gudilu, Ismail Sharif, and Shadi Sheikh. These were all key interlocutors that were critical to the possibility of my doing fieldwork in Mumbai and in slum communities, and as well as in the water department of the BMC. So today, the short talk I have is titled Scarcity, Public Water and the Exclusions of Citizenship in Mumbai. And indeed, as you would have heard earlier, Mumbai has actually no shortage of water problems. And with that, no shortage of scholars that have been thinking with and working on water in Mumbai. I'm thinking particularly of work by Amita Bhide and Pranjal Dikshit in Mumbai, Subodh Wagle as well. And I've learned a lot from this work of scholars on this panel as well, Kajia, Lisa Bjorkman, and also Nikat. Our work overlaps and resonates with each other's claims, focusing particularly on the politics of distribution, that the controversies around water supply in Mumbai are less technical and more political, perhaps, in nature. They're about the practices of distribution and about questions of belonging, what Nick had earlier called identity politics. So today I want to hold that in place for a moment, since I know that my other co-panelists will be talking about this, and move slightly upstream. So down from the last mile of supply up to the first mile of supply. And to do this, I'll be drawing on some of the work I did in my book that was mentioned earlier, Hydraulic City, looking at the politics of scarcity and distribution in Mumbai. Now, my simple argument is this, that concerns over water scarcity around mobilizing sufficient quantities of water produces and legitimates a certain quality of urban politics, where migrants and migration are viewed as a threat. Scarcity talk and the anxiety around scarcity is able to capture increasing amounts of water from farmers in Mumbai's hinterlands. It denies their livelihoods and makes many of them urban migrants. In the city, scarcity talk then denies those same migrants whose water has been taken to the city from getting water in the city. It produces an anxious urban public constantly concerned about water. Now, I'm aware of this scarcity concern only very too well, having grown up in Mumbai, remembering every year a series of newspaper headlines that come out in April or May of every year as the monsoons are advancing or haven't advanced yet, around whether Mumbai is going to go dry, right? This is an annual ritual around water scarcity in Mumbai. Newspaper reports, everyday conversations always remind residents that water supply is limited. Scarcity is both discursively produced through newspaper articles, but also materially experienced, including in this slum community where we worked. A lot of this video work was done in collaboration with two organizations, Akanksha Seva Sangh and Agaz, two youth organizations in Jogeshwari in Mumbai, and I'd like to credit their work here. Scarcity, with water arriving for only a few hours a day on a schedule, residents meet the arrival of water with considerable haste and anxiety, especially those living in slums. For many others, it is virtually impossible to live in Mumbai and not to be anxious about water. Now, I want to suggest that to make this water Mumbai's requires the production of scarcity as a concern. And this concern is deeply felt and it's deeply shared by the public and by state leaders and bureaucrats in Mantralaya that compel administrators to then sanction and improve water connections, more water from dams and more rivers outside of Mumbai. In particular, in rural Thane district, Shahpur Taluk is where much of Mumbai's water is brought from. Now, through calculations based on government documents I have reviewed, and in fact, even if you talk to some of the water engineers off the record, you will learn that there is enough water entering Mumbai for all residents of the city, approximately 4,000 million liters a day, divided by the 15 or 20 million residents, take away some for leakage and you have your figure, which exceeds the amount of water that residents get in cities like London or New York, right? More than 150 liters per person per day. Mumbai's problems do not have to do with insufficient scarcity. They have to do with leakage. Approximately over a third of the city's water was leaking as per one study that was done in 2008. And yet engineers continue to use these flawed population figures and consumption figures to produce a particular kind of problem, suggesting that the problem has to do with insufficient quantities of water that are coming into Mumbai. Now, producing the problem as one of supply allows engineers to resolve distribution stresses by building dams in ever more distant locations. So as soon as one dam is built, when I was finished, the Middle Vedrana Dam was built in 2008, and already plans for the next dam were being made. This despite the fact that the urban population of Mumbai is not projected to increase at the same rate or even increase at all, as per the government's own estimates. Now, to make water Mumbai does not just require this production of scarcity, about this concern over scarcity, it also requires a production of silences, of invisibilities. Silence, the historian Michel Trouillot tells us, is neither natural nor neutral. Silences are produced. So what are the silences that are necessary to make water produced by distant dams as a main kind of water, the dominant kind of water that arrives in Mumbai? The first is a silencing of sources. It requires Mumbai's residents and experts to literally forget the water that they quite literally live on. Now, this is a picture of a water tunnel that was being built in Mumbai in 2008 to carry water, and I'll say a little bit more about this in a minute. In December of 2008, I went to meet with Mr. Gupte, a pseudonym, a city engineer who had promised to show me a new water tunnel project in Mahim. After some conversation, he outfitted me in a safety hat and boots and sent me down this long elevator shaft to 100 meters under the earth. As my eyes adjusted to the artificial light, I was surprised to find that deep in this tunnel construction project, it was pouring rain. This was in January, I think, or December. Now, this rain in December was not just a light subterranean shower, but one that was relentless and prolific. Engineers were walking around in rain gear and umbrellas underground. And as the engineer saw my amazement, he said that the downpour would eventually be halted. The tunnel would eventually be lined with 2-foot wall of reinforced concrete to prevent seepage from the ground above. When the tunnel would be completed, only water from the distant Tansa Dam would be allowed to travel through this tunnel and into the bodies of city residents. Groundwater, the water that was pouring in on us, would be forbidden to enter the city's public system and would need to find somewhere else to disappear. Now, this is not to say that water always cooperates. Disappeared groundwater has a habit of reappearing in unexpected ways, as it did during the catastrophic floods of 2005, as it does flood every year. Nevertheless, city engineers work hard to make sure that this water is invisible, that it remains hidden and unsuitable for human use, to leave it be. Because groundwater is hard to manage through a centralized engineered system that is Mumbai's water supply. So they try and ignore its availability so they can return to the more manageable task of making new dams in more distant locations. The second silence is a silence that is necessary to is a silence that is produced where the demands of city residents obfuscate the needs of people and geography that this water is moved from. Now, this is a newspaper article I took from 2010. The monsoons weren't great in 2009, and the city's dams did not fill as they usually do. So this newspaper article is actually reporting the decision of the state government to actually take water that was meant for irrigation, for farming, and make it and direct it to Mumbai. And the risk that they're taking is the risk of not giving water for irrigation. Today, the city is made viable, not when it rains in Mumbai, but when it rains in and around the 4 dams, all of which are located in Shahpur district, 100 kilometers from the city. By the end of summer, the dam levels in Shahpur are low enough to be of extreme concern for Mumbai's residents. This is when you see those newspaper articles that you see every year, April, May, like I said. With the declining dam levels being printed on newspapers every day, residents get anxious. Will it rain enough? What will happen if it doesn't? But it generally does. We have a kind God One engineer operating these dams up in Shahpur district told me, the dams always overflow. But as this newspaper report shows, the gods of Mumbai's water aren't as kind to all. The residents of the villages in Shahpur district, living a few kilometers from the dam, are denied the water they use for most of the year. This is a photograph taken just like a few meters actually from the Tansa Dam in Mumbai, in Shahpur, sorry. City managers managing the dams in Shahpur know the difficulties residents in Shahpur have in accessing water. Yet, they suggest that the city's dams are too far away to serve Shahpur's residents, or that people didn't need water in Shahpur. Here's a quote. People are preferring to work in Mumbai, one engineer told me. They aren't as interested in agriculture. Agriculture is not in good progress. Of course, the engineer would not mention that agriculture was perhaps less interesting precisely because farmers do not have water. Nor could he explain why if some of Shahpur's residents do not have enough water to drink for some of the year, let alone farm. By directing water away from Shahpur's fields and making more water Mumbai's, the state policy is actually moving farmers and agricultural labor as urban migrants into the cities to work. Now, amongst urban activists, planners, and developers around the world, migration is seen to constitute a critical challenge for cities like Mumbai. In everyday conversations of the city, regardless of class, regardless of political affiliation, migrants are constantly criticized for the dangers they bring. Now, Nikhat, Garth, and Anjali's wonderful paper that you had a chance to hear about earlier makes a really compelling point when they're drawing attention to the obstacles imposed by the bureaucracy to make that formal network connection. Indeed, in my research, I have also found how bureaucratic procedures were designed to turn people away from the bureaucracy and to political patrons, as opposed to incorporating them impersonally in a Weberian state system. The reasons that we heard about, therefore, then are productive of political patronage, are productive of the power of brokers and middlemen and so on. I want to suggest today that this peculiarity of the form, of the application form, and the difficulty that people have in accessing it and making the application, and this peculiarity also of politics, comes in and is born out of the discourses of water scarcity. This discourse requires the policing of citizens' qualities and water's quantities. It is why scarcity talk is so powerful, so problematic, and so important to address. It is important not to take Mumbai scarcity at face value. Now, the city has abundant water, 4,000 million liters a day, both coming into the city, 4,000 million liters a day, plus what is lying underneath the city's ground. The water department has more than enough money. It has more than enough technology, technological ability, right? When I was doing fieldwork now a decade ago, the water department's annual operating budget for operational maintenance was about 300 million US dollars a year. That was their surplus, right? That was not their budget. So we've just learned, I think, through a series of historical accidents, not to see the abundance of resources in Mumbai. What might our city and what might our polity become if we imagine and build the system and the city and the world, starting not from scarcity, but starting instead with the ideas and experiences of abundance? What might our city look like if we start not from scarcity, but abundance? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I just want to say thank you for inviting me for this wonderful conversation on something I wrote about very long ago, but it's been a pleasure to come back to it and also read your wonderful study. And it's nice to see the outcomes that you've come up with after a very intensive field work. And yeah, I look forward to the discussion that we have further. My current work actually has sort of been a larger kind of engagement with religious identity and understanding how religion and religious identity itself shapes the experience of slum life in Mumbai. So studying water was actually just one part of my larger concern of or my larger preoccupation with looking at the Muslim identity in India, in urban India, and particularly in Mumbai slums. My work has been based on multi-sided ethnography, which I've done in Mumbai from 2009 to 16. And I think the focus on water access, I stumbled upon because of the site I selected for conducting my study, and water scarcity was one of the key, features that described marginality in that particular area. So a lot of people I interacted with sort of expressed the lack of water or lack of water access as a kind of characteristic of Muslim life, or Muslim slum, the Muslim experience of slum life, in that particular area. And that's how I got more interested in understanding how identity complicates the idea of access to public goods, something as basic as water. So just to give you a bit of a background on considering my entry point to understanding water access is from religious identity, unlike the work of Nikhil Anand and Lisa Bjorkman. Again, I was a great pleasure reading and learning from your work. I wish I had access to this before I wrote the paper that I'm going to discuss right now. But I think I learned a lot, and it kind of would have helped me say what I wanted to say much more easier when I did not have access to that information. It was not really part of what my research was going to be. But I think I will begin with a bit on what is generally kind of understood about Muslims in Mumbai per se. Muslims form a significant minority. I mean, they are a minority, but still a significant minority, about 22% in Mumbai, and more significant in slums, as your own, the paper that you that you presented and the data in that. I mean, we have about 38% in slums. Over the years, Muslims in Mumbai have faced economic decline. There is enough written about it, so I'm not going to really go into the details, but just like an overview, there has been a socio-cultural decline with a simultaneous rise in, right-wing politics, the politicization of Hinduism in politics, in political culture, in social culture in Mumbai. I think it has become much more pronounced in the 90s. I think one of the biggest landmark kind of events that defined defined the moment for communal politics in Bombay was the 92-93 communal violence that broke out. And since then, there has been a recurrent differentiation in the way the Muslim poor access public goods, be it spatial segregation, be it access to documents for legitimizing your existence in the city itself. So it has major implications for citizenship claims. It has major implications for making claims to access of basic public goods, whether it's electricity, housing, and water, of course, is one of them. What one also sees in post the 90s is that most Muslim areas are very poorly serviced infrastructurally. So there is a dearth of, if this is one of the characteristic features of any Muslim area that you go to, I think more or less also across class. So if you go to any Muslim area, the first thing you notice, or if you speak to people, the first thing they would tell you is that there is hardly any government presence, infrastructural presence. Especially in the area where I conducted fieldwork, state presence was equivalent to police presence. So that was the only, correlation that existed in terms of what was understood as state access or state presence. Over the years, there has also been a dwindling political representation, and it kind of becomes more and more narrow as you go up in the government hierarchy. So clearly, when it comes to making claims, these are major hurdles that Muslims face when it comes to accessing public goods. Yeah, so there were a few key arguments that I actually kind of made in the paper that I have that was published in 2012. It seems like a very, very long time ago. One thing that I kind of found was that religious identity complicates access to water. This is, I think, irrespective of all the challenges and the kind of limitations within which bureaucrats, engineers, plumbers, etc., work in the context of a leaky kind of infrastructure setup. And this is especially more, kind of becomes much more clearer when it comes to the access the Muslim poor face, the hurdles that the Muslim poor face in accessing water, for instance. So for the Muslim poor, apart from these other identities like being a migrant, being your linguistic identity, all of these kind of get intertwined with other regimes of eligibility, like having your documents in place, both formal and informal. So formal in terms of having documents, having papers, etc., but at the same time also informal, which are connected to your own identity, and these form a major hurdle in accessing water. This is what I found. And actually, I think the most interesting aspect that I came across was um, the whole use of intermediaries or brokers in trying to achieve access to water. And this was irrespective of whether they may or may not get access to water. And this definitely complicated the whole system, because they were constantly at a risk of being seen as outsiders or seen as people who did not deserve uh, legitimate water connections, and were seen as dangerous criminals. Something that Nikhil has also looked at in his own book. The other interesting aspect of access for Muslims was the use of political pressure, which again something that you have, Nikhar, looked at in your own study, and which I find the most fascinating. And in the area that I conducted my fieldwork, this was a major, actually the only main election issue. And being a predominantly Muslim slum, this was a major election issue. And I agree with your findings where you say that the and a politician can the vote can definitely swing, and a politician can definitely get more support when issues of water access or issues of these kind are kind of raised as one of the demands from the public. And this was definitely an example of a situation of this kind. So it was popular knowledge that any politician who wants to win an election in this particular area has to make a promise and ensure that there is water access to the constituency. And that had nothing to do with identity politics. This was the only kind of bottom line. Now, in my paper, what I tried to actually also, which is of a greater interest to me, is to also understand what are the limitations of using identity politics for Muslim politicians. Definitely it is a gain for parties like the Shiv Sena. It has definitely been proven to be a gain, but using identity as a kind of tool to mobilize for political mobilization for Muslim politicians is definitely ridden with a lot of challenges. And that is what I have found in my research is something that they cannot really rely on beyond a point. And if I kind of were to quickly kind of read a little bit from the my interactions with, say, for example, this politician, this local corporator whom I call Bablu Bhai, who was a new politician with the Samajwadi Party, who was making an entry into politics, a local business, a local scrap dealer who was trying to make inroads into politics through Samajwadi Party. He had big ambitions, but he chose Samajwadi Party because it kind of gave him the right platform. Being a Muslim, being an immigrant, North Indian immigrant, gave him the right kind of platform to gain support of his potential voters. And however, being a Muslim who could kind of demand, or make sure, take the demands of the public and kind of pressurize the state to see that there is water access, was something which was ridden with a lot of risk and accountability. So he was constantly being, at a local level, there was a lot of pressure on him from, individuals in his neighborhood to see that, there is, that he fulfills his promise. And that is something which I found very, very fascinating. And I think this is something which is very crucial when it comes to uh, uh, the marginalized making political claims for basic goods, public goods of this kind. So this was a small conversation that I a meeting actually of community leaders that I attended at that point in time. Yeah, the men who were present for the meeting had a letter. Each of them had a letter for. This was in the context of an acute crisis. There was absolutely no. This is in 2009 when I was doing fieldwork, and there was absolutely no water supply. Even the little bit of trickling that one could get was not available, and so this was like an emergency meeting of community leaders who had called on Bablu Bhai, who was a local corporator who had just won the elections, and tell him about put pressure on him to kind of take this issue ahead to the Samajwadi Party chief, who had at that point in time been elected and had won from that particular constituency. As we waited, a man commented that Bablu Bhai was one of them. But ever since he had joined the political system, he had lost touch with his constituency. And by one of them, he means a Muslim like themselves. That his heart had become rusted, and the rust will have to be scraped and scraped for it to be removed. And by this is kind of an analogy for public pressure. Bablu Bhai finally arrived wearing a crisp white kurta, carrying both his cell phones in his hand. Everybody in the room got up to make way for him. Some of the others began spreading a mattress for him to sit on. But Bablu Bhai stopped and told them, "No, I'm just like you. I will sit on the floor." He said that he was aware of what was happening at the ground level, and the Samajwadi Party had asked for a crackdown on all illegal connections, but the BMC had been troubling innocent people. He explained his own limitations. "I do not have any power, I just have responsibilities." Bablu Bhai reassured them that he was doing his best. He added, "I take calls of people myself. I am a corporator, not some minister." So he's trying to trying to also portray his image as a people's person and not somebody with a lot of power. "I am from your area, I am your man." Sheikh, who was acting as a spokesperson for the group, asked Bablu Bhai, "What are you doing for the area? Why are there 3 tanks in Mandala, another part of his constituency, not a predominantly Muslim area, and none here?" The exchange between them was kind of like this. Bablu Bhai says, "I don't work, if I don't work in Mandala, they will throw shoes at me. And this is not a Muslim dominated part of his constituency. This is a Hindu dominated constituency. But you have funds. I have already utilized all the funds. If Abu Azmi comes and supports me, I will be able to do something." Abu Azmi has also faced a setback because of his loss in another constituency called Bhiwandi. The government is not ours. So what do we do? So this is a conversation which talks about the pressures of also political leaders, who come from marginalized groups themselves, and the kind of challenges that they face in a larger kind of infrastructural setup, which is dominated by not just the power of knowledge of the system, but also a kind of social capital, a social power. So this is the difference, or this is the kind of what do you call it, a kind of paradox. In a way, political mobilization can also put pressure or also create new challenges for political representatives from marginal groups, because ultimately not all political representatives belong to same social groups. And that is what I try to highlight through the paper.
Namaste to you all. I know we are in different time zones, so and a big thank you for Columbia Global Center In this today's session, I thought I would be associated with the overall view, but we are discussing the case studies. I don't have the case studies with me, but what I would like to do is I would be discussing some of my learnings, probably trying to give you a macro view from the bureaucratic point of view. These are purely my views, which I learned from experience in the field and interactions. And maybe sometime, somewhere, it would be a little cryptic to the extent that I really do not believe that Mumbai is tapped out. So it would be a little to that effect. But nevertheless, I would give you my inputs on that, and then later on, maybe we can elaborate or we can discuss. So, like I said, the first point I would like to say is Mumbai, as was brought out by Nikhil Anandji, Mumbai has immense quantity of water to provide for everyone. Now, if that is so, where is that the people have that feeling of being tapped out? Where is this weariness, tiredness coming in from? And some of the issues which you have highlighted come from your learnings as yes, there is a big power play here.
I mean, it's a very, very relevant question. I would agree with Nikhar on that. I mean, I would not, for example, give a value judgment on what the role of brokers is, because especially in the context of those who are, I mean, one is that there are various kinds of brokers. So there are, so if you were to just look at them as intermediaries in the context of water, and in the place where I conducted my fieldwork, they were definitely enabling access to state resources. Not just in terms of, I mean, of course, it came at a price. I mean, residents did have to pay something for it, but it was not any different from, for example, bribing a government official or for accessing or making their papers move ahead, for example, in a very cumbersome smoke screen kind of a infrastructural setup that we have. So it to me it kind of is representative of is symptomatic of the whole political system and the way infrastructure is designed to sort of I don't know whether it is really by design or it just is an effect of the way infrastructure is in urban India, where there is definitely a greater incentive if you have a certain social capital to access it, but then if you don't, you have to have access to an intermediary, in order to do that. So I actually find, therefore, this whole argument of mediation and the fact that the way the state system functions sort of enables or sort of creates an effect where there is a need for mediation. There is a need for political mediation, and especially for those who are marginalized, who do not have any representation in the in the political system to pressure the state to get access to resources, which is a basic right, but then claims have to be made towards it. So I would not, also make a value judgment on brokers. Because they are the ones who actually try to create different forms of knowledge, in a way countering the knowledge of the bureaucrats or the engineers or the plumbers. So it is not like it is not, I mean, they do have a, what do you call it? I mean, it's like a counter, a kind of a critique or a counter kind of, contrary to dominant forms of knowledge. They create their own systems of knowledge in order for the marginalized to access state resources. I mean, that is how I see it.
May I
but
just
it's
jump in
definitely something that one could really explore more through future research, and it's
I just wanted to thank you, Dr. Contact, to just jump in and emphasize and underline one point that you made, which is, I think it's very important to consider brokers in the context of the communities in question, which is when we're looking at very poor, marginalized communities, it's oftentimes that these groups of citizens have not had much experience interacting with state bureaucracies or state apparatuses, whether it's bureaucratic or even electoral. And so in those contexts, it's the combination of not having those kinds of experiences, not knowing how to exactly go about, apply for a driver's license or what, voter ID card. Whereas, richer citizens, people who have more sort of social capital, don't necessarily need, they have other mechanisms by which they can access these features of the state. And so it really is this combination of being marginalized, not having conventional sources and channels by which you can interact with the state, that then creates spaces where brokers begin to occupy a bigger role. And I just wanted to also mention that I think you're absolutely right, Dr. Contactor, that this is a symptomatic of a broader political phenomena in India, and it's in rural parts of India and urban India. This is not specific to water or even infrastructure. I think this is something that we need to acknowledge and think about. And I appreciate the call for future research in this area.
Yeah, just one thought. These brokers, can we treat them as the enablers for these people who could not have had the mechanism or the means of achieving the public goods which they had access to? So this is one thought. They are enablers of course, they are charging their service charges to an extent. But there is the bad side to it that the government, which should be giving it as a free service, is not getting. So like what happened in the railway reservation, there were a number of brokers. Now with having a better platform of IT, there are no more brokers now. People at their home, they can get the railway reservations and can fly off, move on. So that's sort of again, this is an intervention which probably will come out from a better study how we can develop this.
The point being made by all of you is that we need to look at these intermediaries as enablers in some ways, and until we don't have more other structures where people aren't going to require that there's more literacy on these issues, and there's more power to these communities who it's not only a question of technological know-how, but it's definitely also a question of power, because the layers are so complicated.
Small little point over there about the cost. Just to kind of clarify that the cost of paying to brokers also replaces the other social costs of humiliation, of the kind of aggression that marginalized groups face when interacting with state or bureaucracy. So it's not necessarily lack of contact or lack of know-how. It is also a kind of an exchange for a bad experience, or the whole the aggression that one faces, or the kind of the social costs or humiliation that one faces while accessing these are replaced by a monetary cost that you pay to a broker, who would probably be more will be able to negotiate through the knowledge that he or she has gained a system instead of you.
While we're on the subject of costs, a question has come about understanding from Rajat Baisani about understanding the limits of financing for governments. But how does that, is the right to water then contingent on the financing ability, or is it a right that citizens can claim in any case? And two, does the learning from setting up of the social development unit that allowed volunteers to act as in-betweens, has there been any uptake from the BMC on that?
Okay, let me put, I have not actually been in touch with BMC on this because they have their own different system of dealing with it. As regards to the cost of finance, there are usually allocations for particular year. Different societal things have to be done, works have to be carried out. So if you want to take a full-fledged system renovation, that is not possible. So you have to go to the worst system, and that is where the optimization techniques come into pictures. So that is what they usually do, or where there are more pressures. But to see his point, there are limitations, yes, financial limitations. No, they do not outweigh the public good. Public will have right. They should have right. So it is about the delivery of the system, water to the public. Yes, it has to be done. And because more of the Mumbai is covered currently, and there are small pockets which are not currently covered, that can be worked out.
Nikhil, the question is, I'm going to take it to you because it's about, you spoke about privatization, and Nikhar, you spoke about the limits of privatization as well. So the question is, what is the role of the middle class, in this? I mean, is there any opposition to privatization from the middle class, or does the middle class act as a consumer that wants more choices? How do you see the middle class becoming? How do you see this as a middle class issue, as well? And how can the middle class be mobilized into thinking about water for all?
Yeah, this is like one of the great paradoxes, which makes water really interesting to study. And that is this, that the middle class is actually benefiting significantly more in the public system than any other social group. As Dr. Mahajan pointed out, water is subsidized, and it's also subsidized for the middle class, and they're drawing far more water than those living in the slums. Yet the ideological support for privatization, I think, is coming from the middle class, despite their benefiting in the public system, right? I think one of the questions around privatization is the idea that if you like pay the cost of water, you will get better service, right? Now, Mumbai is a very interesting city for many reasons. First is that there's a large number of groups that are not paying the costs of water, that are not paying their water bills. And studies of BMC lists that of defaulters that have been done by Pani Haq Samiti, for example, have shown how it's actually like large central government institutions and wealthy landowners that are actually the biggest defaulters, I think, with water bills. So that is one, like paradox. But the second is that even with all the defaulting, Mumbai's water department is still spectacularly in the black. Like I said, a 300 crore operating surplus every year. This is when I last did research on the topic, right? And the surplus is because a large amount of Mumbai's water revenues are coming not from metering, but by an older system of water taxation that is pegged to the property taxes of older water connections, right? So this is to say that if we were to go to a private fee-for-service model, Mumbai's water department would actually be a lot more precarious financially than it is now, right? So privatization would actually produce financial weaknesses in the water budgets and the financing of water infrastructure improvements in Mumbai, right? So I'm not very optimistic of the hopes of privatization in this context, but and also because it's not very clear. It's very clear actually that there's no possibility of competition and fair price setting when you're talking about something that is inherently a monopoly-driven supply system like water or electricity, right? You can't suddenly say, I will go with a different vendor because there is only one provider. So that's another reason to be a little bit more cautious, I think, of privatization in this time.
Thank you, Nikhil. Just to build on some of your comments, I wanted to add that, in the context of Mumbai, what we see is that people who are not accessing water from the BMC, getting water from private sources, end up spending around 250 times the cost of water provided by BMC. And that's precisely as Nikhil mentioned, that's because the BMC subsidizes water and in line with this idea that the government cares about this fundamental right towards water access, as Dr. Mahajan mentioned as well. And so at least in this context, we know that public water is extremely beneficial economically for citizens. One of the conundrums and paradoxes that we see in this context then is that because richer parts of the city have access to water in the high rises, et cetera, where water is guaranteed, we're actually seeing that it's cheaper to be rich and more expensive to be poor, because in the communities and bustings where there isn't access to government water, people are having to pay a lot more to access this to access illegal private water. But that, all that said, I don't again have a overall value judgment on the costs and benefits of privatization. It is possible, I think, in an alternate world in which if we had a privatization of water in a way that's well regulated, in a way where competition is promoted, you might end up seeing that being a possible way by which you can get more cost-effective water supplies to citizens. I know in cities such as Mexico City, where there's a lot of private provision of water, the costs are not as high as we're seeing in the Mumbai context. But partly that's because in the Mumbai context, the private water is also illegal water. And so the illegality of it makes the provision of the water much more expensive. So just a couple more thoughts on this.
I'm going to ask about a question that came from Dr. Mistry, and he talked about Mumbai and the dangers of climate change and dealing with issues around water and water supply. Is there any kind of planning for climate change in our overall futuristic water policy when we're thinking of water management for the city? And I don't mean this in terms of scarcity, but really in planning for disaster and planning for the future. With how does climate change feature into that? And maybe Dr. Mahajan, you can address this one.
So about Mumbai, they had some plans, but Mumbai, it's a very difficult situation to have water retained into the lower soils as well. But this is a very critical problem across the India, rural areas, where the water is being largely used even for agriculture and gets dissipated a lot. So therein, we are having a lot of schemes. What you must have heard, Jal Yukta Shivar Abhiyan, which was there. It was basically meant to percolate the water down, putting by multiple small interventions, which would allow the water to settle down and go deep in the water, regenerate the groundwater. Currently, the government of India has addressed nearly 6 major states. In these 6 major states, there are some areas where the groundwater is in critical stage now. It has gone down very low. Semi-critical, critical stage areas have been taken over, and for that they have floated a scheme wherein such interventions would be taken, where the data would be collected. Basically, whenever we want to have the solutions, you need to have the ground data, what has come out from these 2, 3 good researchers, and then build onto that data the intervention. So we have certain data, we'll be putting that into the public domain. And based on that, we would be interacting with the public as well, because we want it to be a responsibility of the citizens, not only of the government, because finally it's going to impact the citizens. So citizens need to make the informed decisions on that. They need to be aware. So that is the whole project. The project is called Atal, Bhujal. So Atal is the name which has been given, but the Bhujal is something which it deals with. And that is what you were asking. The groundwater is being targeted, because that came out as an issue when we targeted the rural water supplies. There are not like big reservoirs in rural areas, and the distances make the cost of transportation from reservoirs very huge. So you have to go down to the standalone water sources, which basically are groundwater sources. And there it becomes a very critical problem. So that's how we are targeting it now.
So while I have you, I also want to, we've been talking about the scientific research that is coming out on issues of water, which is showing, distribution issues, equity issues, technical issues, and then, access and delivery issues. How much is the appetite of the government to take in independent research that comes out from our scientific community? How does the scientific community interface with the government, both for sharing research and two, for do you have special pilots that you're doing? One of the critiques that we hear is that there aren't enough pilots, and so when the technological decisions come 10 years later, the risk and the appetite for pilots is low. So how would our scientific community and among our audiences, as well as the current community, be able to, at least in the case of Maharashtra or Mumbai, be able to access and share their work and share their research with the government? Could you suggest some openings for that?
Yeah, I could suggest. See, there has to be an effort. What I can say is there have been some of the people who come to us. They have been coming with the product sale ideas. What happens is the interventions have to be tested, then it has to be proved, and it has to go to a particular level of specification which have been demanded by the government, at least from the point of view of service delivery. But these things are not tested, and people try to sell the interventions on a large scale because government is a big market. Yes, it is a big market, but it has to be tested and it has to be tried. And for that, what is necessary is a pilot. What you say, very rightly said. But pilot proposal have to reach somewhere. And I'm not saying it's an easy job, because I have dealt with them. People come with one person had come to me an idea with having said, okay, we will be privatizing the reservoirs thing, and I will be spending it on my land, and then you sponsor it. So there are multiple ideas. It becomes difficult. There has to be a mechanism, like what we tried in Swachh Bharat. We made a particular level of interaction with the industries, where they formulated a level. They took in the interventions, they vetted them to a level, they screened it, and then they came up to a higher level. So if we are able to build in some mechanism somewhere, these things would come up they would help in a long way, because there are very beautiful and creative minds who are sitting out there in public. They have using their minds and creating interventions, which can be useful. So that's my take on that.
Okay, and I want to turn to Dr. Contractor and ask her about, you very effectively demonstrated, some of the struggles that the governance, bodies from, how do we empower citizens? How do we put water on the agenda for communities? You've identified the problem in minority areas where this is so difficult to get enforced because there's an overall bias against understanding that these are rights of those communities as well. So my question then to all of you in some ways, and starting with you, Dr. Contractor, is how do we reimagine, water access, and with water crisis becoming a very large global agenda? How do we bring about, I know there are amazing nonprofit organizations that work on this as well. And I know Pukar is here, and you've worked with Yuva, and other groups that are also part of, researching, coordinating data, which is hard to integrate, and bringing this knowledge, to enabling communities. But if I could have some thoughts from the panel on how do we, what might be some solutions that we can think about where water access, the demand for it or the delivery for it, what would you take forward? So I'm going to start with you, Dr. Contractor.
There have been a lot of experiments on improving access. So, for example, if you were to look at the public distribution system, they had introduced a suggestion book where people were, expected to write their complaints, and there was somebody who was supposed to look at it. And so, I think increased interaction between bureaucrats and between technological staff in infrastructure with the areas or the people whom they are providing service to definitely improves, it definitely helps to get a lot of the, this is also shown by your own study, Nikhar, where you have interventions. You have, kind of a enabler who kind of provides some kind of assistance in getting formalization. And that definitely has an impact because of just a kind of an exchange or a communication between the two. Because these are two separate spheres, like the technological problems related to water delivery, which Mr. Mahajan has been speaking about, and which are definitely rightfully so problems. But then there are also these other problems related to societal inequality and the kind of differentiation in access, which is based on denial of rights, etc. That's one part of it. The other part, of course, is a more larger change, which again is something which not just academics of course have like me, for example, or I'm sure Nikhil will agree, so would Nikhar, that there is a need for us also to get our research and our ideas across to the government to see what can be changed. That is, of course, one whole thing. And then the larger issue of political change. There has to be some way in which, infrastructure and governance mechanisms have to be more geared towards not reinforcing social inequalities, reinforcing, giving more power to those who are already powerful, but rather look at larger international discourses on equality, equal access. That is something which I think we need to hold our governments accountable to as well. So, yeah.
Thank you. Nikhil, to you.
Thanks for that question. Right, so the question of how do we reimagine ourselves out of this water crisis? I think it's not, I would like to think past crisis. I think in part because I think as Dr. Mahajan was pointing out, we're not tapped out in Mumbai. There are crises elsewhere. And I'll get back to that. But also because crisis talk actually favors the powerful, right? And we see this again and again. It's the powerful that can buy their way through political connections or financial resources out of crisis, right? And I think this is where it's important to think from abundance and not from scarcity, just to go back to the original point, because we can say living in Mumbai, thinking in Mumbai, working in Mumbai, that there is abundant water in Mumbai, but our histories of engineering and our histories of urban government have taught us not to see all the water that there is. Now, not seeing this water actually has two consequences. One is we're pulling water from Shahpur, from Thane district. The other is we're then having to create all these infrastructure projects to push water out of the city. And this is the subject of my new book on climate change and drainage, right? And so not seeing water in Mumbai for Mumbai is actually a problem, both in terms of flooding and also in terms of water scarcity. So we need to think about ways in which we may hold water in the city, and many options are coming up in that quick Q&A. And as a way to both engage climate uncertainty, rainfall cannot be forgotten, but also as a way of provisioning in times of erratic monsoons, in times of intensified rain showers and the like. What are the ways in which we can hold water and use it where it falls, right? This is the work of Anu Mathur and Dilip Lacuna. And this way of seeing water and living with water, I think is important, not just for cities, but also, as Dr. Mahajan pointed out, also for rural areas, right? And I'm happy to hear of these schemes to encourage that. In a sense, we're talking about reimagining water as we did in 1800, as water being held and not water being channeled, right? And finally, I think the point that Kudsia brought up, and also Dr. Mahajan and Nikhar brought up around distribution justice, right? We cannot let go of this question of distribution justice. As we heard today, the standard for what a good water supply is varies based on who you are and where you live. So for example, as we heard, in rural areas, we're trying to distribute 60 LPCD. In slums, we're trying to distribute 90 LPCD. In high-rise buildings, 150 LPCD is sometimes the standard. Why are these inequalities built into the design of water infrastructures, right? We need to have, as Dr. Martin was pointing out, get to the third level of looking at equity across and distribution with equity as well. Some groups are not able to create the infrastructure or pay for the infrastructure on their own. There's no reason that water connections have to be paid for by the consumer. They can be paid for at least until the house by the city. There's enough funding for that. So I think that both thinking of both the reimagining our way out of crisis, but also by focusing on justice are two important things we need to do at this time.
Thank you. And the final comments from you, Nikhar. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ravina. Maybe this is a really good topic to end the symposium as well. I think my overarching takeaway from the research that my collaborators and I have done in Mumbai, but also from listening to this panel, is that there isn't a silver magic bullet that's going to solve the issues surrounding water access. This needs to be a collective endeavor. We need multi-party stakeholders both from the government, but also from the scientific community and the engineering community, as well as civil society actors playing a crucial role in solving some of these issues. So in our work, we've collaborated really closely with Yuva and Pani Hak Samiti, and these groups have been doing a lot of really excellent work with respect to empowering citizens and helping citizens access water from the state. Continuing to support those kinds of activities at the civil society level, along with interventions where the government can also begin to learn from more lessons from ongoing research in both the scientific and social scientific communities, is going to be essential for coming up with a multi-party solution to these issues. And I would also point the finger back to us. I think us as scholars, we should take on more responsibility in terms of thinking through the various complex issues surrounding water access. And I think that there should be more of an onus on the academic community to do more research in this area, to support graduate students, to do dissertation work in this space, because I really think this combination of scholarly, government, and civil society endeavors together can help us as a society make more progress with respect to water access.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Please do stay engaged with our programs, subscribe to our list, and we hope to continue to bring you programs such as this. Thank you once again, Dr. Mahajan, Dr. Contractor, Dr. Anand, and Dr. Gaikwad, and all of you for joining in and being such an active and interactive audience. Bye-bye.